Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and I'm sending love to you whether it's day or night, evening or morning, and I hope you're going to get that lovely cup of coffee or cocoa because I've got a fabulous story for you. You could of course be walking your dogs or listening to me somewhere else, but wherever you are so welcome to the channel. So before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Armel and I'm from rural Kentucky, and my Bigfoot encounter happened in 2015 in an unlikely event where encountering a Bigfoot was the last thought on my mind at the time, and certainly the most unlikely place that I would ever expect a rendezvous with the hairy critter. I grew up in Kentucky with my parents and my brother Neville, and living in the rural countryside was the only life we ever knew. And I consider myself remarkably privileged to grow up surrounded by such exquisite, flawless treasures of the natural world. We grew up in a quintessential two-storey, whitewashed, rustic farmhouse that had belonged to generations of our family before us. So over the years it has been renovated and restored, but the original foundations still actually stand. My parents transformed the lower part of our home into a large open-plan living space, where the kitchen, living areas and television room is just one large living space, and they also incorporated some floor-to-ceiling sliding doors on the lower floor so we could really appreciate the exquisite views over our large picturesque pond, the imposing statuesque mountains in the distance, the rolling green valleys, and of course the vast areas of dreamy forest that flanked the right-hand side of our property, which was an idyllic haven for the indigenous wildlife from the white-tailed deer, rabbits, foxes, squirrels, chipmunks, skunks and raccoons. Growing up, there were all kinds of television documentaries all about Bigfoot at the time, and I was certain that the ambiguous, mysterious creature did actually exist, because on our farm there was very clear signs of Bigfoot activity. But I was always heartily disappointed, because we never got to observe or see the hairy critter for ourselves. It was almost as if looking for Bigfoot made him become even more evasive and elusive, almost making me wonder if he actually knew I was looking out for him and was purposely hiding in the shadows and was making himself way too obscure to ever be detected. There was one occasion as kids when we were playing out in the woods that my brother and I got the very distinct impression that we were definitely being watched. But when we looked around the woods, we saw nothing was there, yet we knew without a shadow of a doubt that we had been observed by unseen eyes. Later that day we did discover these huge 17-inch footprints in the mud in close proximity to our pond, so we were pretty certain that they were from a Bigfoot. I do remember we even made plaster casts of the footprints, and they were colossal. On one occasion my dad was convinced he'd actually seen the hairy humanoid cross his path when he was returning home one night, late after an evening playing bridge with a neighbour. My mother had fallen asleep in the front seat of the car, but awoke very suddenly when she heard my dad say, "What the heck? Well, I never in a month of Sundays. Did you see that?" "See what?" she asked, wiping the sleep from her eyes. My dad looked at her with eyes as wide as saucers. "I think I just saw a Bigfoot," he said excitedly, "but it moved too quickly for me to see it clearly enough. But I do not believe it could have been anything else, and it was most certainly not a bear." "Are you sure you're not mistaken?" my mother had asked him. "Very sure," said my father. "The kids are right. We do indeed have a Bigfoot on our land." Growing up, my parents were very close and very much in love, and were pretty much inseparable. We were a very close, loving family, but things fell apart when my dad was tragically killed riding a dirt bike in the countryside with a friend, and it would seem his bike lost traction and went hurling down a rocky embankment, while my dad's body was flung violently into a tree, killing him instantly. This happened when I was about 18 years old, and it shook our family incredibly hard, and I don't think any of us ever came to terms with his tragic sudden demise, because while you learn to live with tragedy, you never really fully come to terms with it. When I was about 30, after I was married, my husband purchased our old family farmhouse from my mother so that we could raise our 2 kids there, and give them the fabulous outdoor life that we had heartily enjoyed ourselves at their ages. My brother Neville was a surgeon in Houston, Texas, and expressed no desire to buy the family farmhouse, so I was the one privy to buying it, and I snapped it out without a second thought. My mother remained in rural Kentucky, but she did value her independence greatly and didn't want to live with us. So she chose to move to a very attractive apartment block in close proximity to our farmhouse so that she could regularly visit her grandchildren, which is what she invariably did. Her apartment was on the ground floor with its own patio and large sliding doors, which overlooked the magnificent views of fields of pretty pasture where horses were frolicking and grazing happily. And in the far distance you could observe the hilly elevations of statuesque mountains rising up in the blue firmament like masterful giants. And on the rear side of her apartment it was flanked by a vast area of dreamy national forest that was accessible to the public with generous hiking trails and was superbly maintained by the Forestry Commission. My mother was in her 70s, and so she was lucky to be living in an apartment block that was so expertly managed by a fastidious, very scrupulous young manager called Christopher Ball, who ensured that the running of the apartments was plain sailing and assiduous. He ensured that the individual terrace gardens always looked exquisite, with colourful seasonal flowers alongside perfectly manicured hedges and meticulously mowed lawns. Little did we know that behind the closed doors of my mother's apartment lay a deep, dark secret that was festering away and gradually getting out of control, and was something we were obliviously unaware of, because every time we would pick my mother up from her premises, we were never invited into her apartment. At that time I never smelt a rat, as I should have done, but thought she was so eager to see her grandchildren and wanted to get going, which was why she was always eagerly waiting for us in the car park to collect her. Little did we know that her smouldering secret was not going to remain suppressed for very much longer. One day I received a rather peculiar and strange telephone call from Christopher Ball, who said my mother's problem was getting way out of control and was actually attracting rats. He told me that the residents were very concerned about the huge infestation of vermin on the premises. They believed wholeheartedly that my mother was entirely responsible. As you can imagine, I was befuddled, because I had no idea what Christopher was talking about. But I quickly made my way to the apartment blocks to find out what on earth was going on. Why in the world would the residents believe my mother was inviting rats to the premises? Nothing made any sense at all. I was grateful that it was a Tuesday morning, as that was the time when the local bus would take all the elderly residents, which included my mother, of course, to the local town for a spot of shopping, so I could have a discussion with Christopher Ball about my mother's so-called problem. "I need to show you something," he told me. "Follow me." Christopher opened the door to my mother's apartment, and I nearly had a double heart attack on the spot. My eyes grew as wide as saucers, and my mouth dropped to the floor at this rude, horrifying awakening. It was like a bolt out of the blue, seeing my mother's apartment transformed into a deplorable dump. My mother's stinking apartment was so crammed with stuff from every single nook and cranny that you could barely even enter the premises, and I'm not kidding either. I was shocked because there were piles of newspapers and books piled on top of each other like the Leaning Tower of Pisa, and they were absolutely everywhere. Apart from being a fire hazard, it was also potentially a death trap, because one knock in the wrong direction, you could be buried alive under a bunch of very heavy junk. Then, of course, the obnoxious fumes from dust, mould and venom scat were also a dreadful health hazard. It was incredible that my mother could breathe in this place. My mother's gritty, gross apartment was littered and cluttered with all kinds of articles, so many I can't even mention them. Boxes, plastic bags, and pretty much everything that you could even imagine to think about was stacked into hazardous high piles, and I was horrified to see that my mother was not even sleeping in her own bed, because even her bed was piled up with all kinds of odds and ends, and worse still, even her bath was full of bags of clothes, accessories, and kitchen gadgets. I realised to my amazement that my mother wasn't even having baths. She was being unhygienic, and was sleeping in a little corner of the room, almost like a vagrant. It was like I was walking into a rubbish tip, and I was completely floored and outraged that she was living in such objectionable conditions. I could hardly believe it. I personally was finding it difficult to breathe in her apartment, so I don't know how she could. It was so stuffy and rank, and the whole house smelt of sewage. It was so disgusting. How on earth had my mother lived like this for so many years behind our back? No wonder the neighbours were complaining about a rat problem. How and why had this happened, I asked Chris. I had no idea my mother was living in such squalid conditions. She hid this so well from us. I'm sorry, said Chris. I had no idea she'd been hiding the secret of hers from her own family. It invariably happens sometimes. It's called hoarding, and it's a condition where a person forms an attachment to everything she owns and simply can't let go of anything. Many of the residents here have observed your mother going through their dumpsters and examining piles of their rubbish to retrieve things that they've thrown away, like old ice cream cartons and plastic cutlery, for example. You see, a hoarder can find 100 reasons why the finished toilet roll should not be thrown away, because one day it could be useful for a school science project or something like that. They always find a reason to keep all kinds of crazy stuff that you and I would throw away instantly. What am I going to do? I said, looking at Chris with a hopeless, defeated expression on my face. This has completely got out of control. And how could anybody live like this? It boggles my mind. I am well and truly stumped. You need to get a counsellor to work with your mother as quickly as you possibly can, so we can help her throw this stuff away, because it is a huge health hazard to all the people in the apartment block. We need to follow the procedures, because your mother could have a mental breakdown if we just threw away her trash behind her back. You see, it's very likely she's attached to all her things, and will be very reluctant to part with any of them. Before long, a specialist in hoarding problems was actually working with my mother, and I was mortified to see how obstinate and resistant my mother was, as everything that the therapist suggested she throw away, she invariably found 101 reasons why the object in question was still exceedingly useful to her. I need those, she said, pointing at the plastic cutlery we were trying to throw away. What if I go on a picnic sometime? I couldn't believe that this was actually my mother, the very same woman who raised me to be so particular and who got so upset with us as kids if my brother or I so much as left a thing lying on the bedroom floor. But now she was the one living in a house of horrors. There was dust absolutely everywhere, on every available surface. Odours were virtually cemented into the carpet. A couple of dead rodents and a lone raccoon were found lying deceased, and their bodies dried up, buried and pressed down beneath piles of magazines. The carpet was now threadbare and had been devoured by hungry moths, and the apartment was teeming with roaches, beetles and rats. It would seem that there was a vast range of spider species making the most of this Aladdin's cave of delicious insects that were like a constant supply of fast food for them. They had layered down their silken webs in every available corner, and one web was so huge it was easily over a foot wide, and its resident was the fattest and largest spider that I've ever seen. One day we thought we had a breakthrough with my mother, when she suddenly agreed to throw out a lot of her stuff, and everything was hastily being sorted into piles. Now that she'd actually given us the green light to throw out as much stuff as we could, we worked quickly in case she changed her mind. There was one pile labelled stuff to keep, another stuff to throw out, and another was stuff to give to charity. We began to throw away large boxes of superfluous stuff that she would never ever need. I watched in horror as I saw my mother downcast expression as piles of her crap were being laden into the rubbish truck. How was it possible to be so attached to such squalor, I wondered in horror. What on earth had happened to my mother to make her develop such an attachment to so much of her stuff? Just when I began to falsely believe that things were going incredibly well, as my mother seemed to be putting up very little resistance in letting go of some of her stuff, one of my mother's neighbours surreptitiously called me to one side and told me that she'd seen my mother the previous night stuffing items in a shopping trolley and hiding them out there in the woods, and repeatedly making several journeys. I saw her. She was creeping out of the house at 9 p.m. last night, she whispered. She kept going backwards and forwards with piles of her stuff at all hours of the night, and I think she's hiding it all out in the woods for safekeeping so that you don't find it and throw it away. I was absolutely devastated to hear this alarming news, and so I made my way to the wooded area to observe how much stuff my mother was actually hiding from us. As I ventured ever closer to the woods, I could hear this loud rustling sound, and strange, rather animated chattering voices, and something in my head told me to tread very quietly and to remain hidden, which is exactly what I did, and I don't even know why I did it in the first place, but I did. I made my way behind one tree and quietly tiptoed to another and then to another, until I found myself in a perfect position to observe what was actually going on. It was here that I could see piles of my mother's trash, but it was who was going through it that startled me the most. Oh my God, I thought to myself, hardly daring to believe what I was actually seeing. It's Bigfoot! And better still, there were two of the critters, and I was able to observe them without being seen by them from only yards away. It didn't get better than that. How often when I was a child had I longed and yearned for an encounter with the hairy humanoid, and here at my mother's apartment block, yards behind her property, were two of these extraordinary creatures going through my mother's rubbish with animated enthusiasm. At least someone found her crap good. I was so spellbound by what I was observing that all thoughts of the immediate task at hand all disintegrated as I watched these critters with a mixture of total awe and wondrous amazement. "So you are real," I muttered under my breath. "I knew you were real." I was so excited and my heart was fluttering with impetuous eagerness of a young child at Christmas opening their stocking. I felt the same level of rapturous excitement, and I'm not kidding either. I stood there holding on to the wide trunk of a very large tree and peering ever closely to watch the Bigfoots, and they were so comical as they dived through my mother's stuff with such a passionate zealousness. I could tell they were really fired up as they rifled through things, and when they didn't know what something was used for, they would launch into this heated discussion together that sounded rather like gibberish, and they would speak to each other backwards and forwards for a very long time. One of the creatures was female because she had pert hair-covered breasts and was easily over 8 foot tall, 4 foot wide, and about 900 pounds. The other creature had a male energy about him, and although bigger than her, I sensed he might have been her son. He was about 9 foot tall, 5 foot wide, and easily over 1,000 pounds. They were both covered in long flowing chestnut hair, and they had those typical cone-shaped heads and overlong arms, so typically seen in Bigfoots. But one thing you never ever appreciate until you actually observe a Bigfoot for the very first time is just how extraordinary colossal these creatures actually are. I noticed that they were built like giants. They were very powerful, strong, lofty and majestic, and in my opinion, magnificent, awesome creatures. The female was examining an old handbag, and she had absolutely no idea what it was used for, and proceeded to try it on her head, but immediately took it off, realising that the mouth of the bag would never ever fit her large head. It seemed that the critters had a heated debate, trying to decide what the handbag was used for, and they couldn't come to an agreement about it. The creatures rifled through various containers, and when they found a plastic container with a lid that held all kinds of odds and ends, one of the creatures made an ooh sound and became incredibly excited. They looked at each other with a look of animated enthusiasm on their faces as they suddenly realised the storage benefits of such a container. I imagine they realised that they could store nuts or fruit in such a box, which seemed like a good idea to them. They discussed the container at length, with jubilant looks on their faces, and their passionate ardour was so charming to watch and observe, and it moved me to the core. When they came across 2 frying pans, they banged them together as if they were some kind of a musical instrument, and they were so pleased with the clanging sound that the pans were making, and seemed incredibly thrilled with them. The creatures seemed to think most of my mother's stuff was absolute rubbish, which they were right about, of course, as they threw aside magazines, bottles, and all kinds of clothes. The Bigfoots finally settled for the frying pans, a plastic container, and a large shopping bag, which they put to one side to keep. Yet for a very long time I watched them chattering away excitedly to each other as they continued to discuss the items in the trash. They would pick up the item, feel it, examine it, and even smell it, and then they would chatter away excitedly together about the object, as if they were pondering what a human would use a thing like this for, almost like it was some kind of a history lesson or something. After a long while I heard a very loud wood knock coming from a fair distance away, and the female immediately responded to the knock with a long drawn-out whistle that reminded me very much of a bird that I've often heard in the forest before. The 2 critters grabbed the objects that they'd selected from my mother's trash and glided back into the woods, and they moved like a seamless wind with such agility and grace. I imagined that a member of their family had been calling out to them. I stood there for a moment in utter silence, I was so stunned and overwhelmed by what I'd seen that I burst into happy tears. It was the most exciting moment of my entire life. I returned to my mother's apartment with a huge grin on my face, and no one could understand why I was so happy. I told no one what I'd seen, as I felt it was a secret that I just did not want to share. To cut a long story short, my mother did end up receiving counselling and was finally able to throw away all of her trash. My husband and I refurbished her entire apartment and laid down a brand new carpet, and we brought my mother a brand new bed as well, with the cosiest, most sumptuous bed linen. When my mother saw how exquisitely beautiful and spacious her home was, she actually broke down into fits of tears. She was so joyful. "It's so beautiful," she gasped. "I can't believe all the space that I have now." After the counselling, my mother changed and really got her life back in order, and now she keeps her apartment fastidiously clean and has adopted 2 gorgeous cats. The therapist believed my mother's excessive hoarding was an extension of the grief at the loss of my dad after the tragic accident on the back of his dirt bike. I asked my mother if I could keep the picture I found of my dad on his dirt bike, and I took it home and placed it on the refrigerator. Imagine my surprise when my young son Mark turned to his sister Lucy and said, "Mum has a picture of the man we've seen on the dirt bike." I looked at my children in shocked disbelief. "Have you seen this man before?" I asked them both in surprise. "We've seen him a few times riding his dirt bike on our land," said my son. "We did not know who he was, but he always smiles." I smiled to myself. My 2 children had seen their deceased grandfather on our land riding his bike, and it didn't get better than that. So there you are. That's my story. Thank you so much for that incredible story. And it is true, they do say that hoarding is something that happens to people, and often as a result of a tragic loss of death of somebody that they love. It's a way of coping and holding on to things and not wanting to let go. But it's wonderful that your mother managed to find the help that she invariably needed. Until next time, goodbye and good night.